Before we start, I think we have to acknowledge that the ideas being discussed here are quite difficult, quite technical, and quite esoteric. I think there's a problem that too often in these talks, the audience is asked to take too many things on faith. Because we are scientists, you have to believe us. And so to avoid that as much as possible today, I would like to begin with a quick primer, after which I'll turn it over to Dr. Jain. And if there's anything that you feel is missing from my primer, please feel free to add to it. Okay, so an introduction to population genetics. The human species originated from a single group of ancestors around 200,000 years ago in Africa. Okay? So remember, we think of human history as being a 5,000 to 10,000 year affair, but human beings have existed for over 100,000 years. In the intervening time from our origination, multiple migrations of humans out of Africa have colonized the entire world, leading to the formation of physically distinct and sometimes also not so distinct groups. Okay, so that's part one. Part two is that all of us, we have thousands of ancestors. Each of us has 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-great-grandparents, 16 great-great-great-grandparents. So the number gets very large very fast. And each of us today, all of our chromosomes is a mosaic of DNA from all those ancestors. Using advances in DNA sequencing technology and computational statistical methods, we can now today begin to partially, incompletely, imperfectly, but still better than ever before, reconstruct the patterns of ancestry in our chromosomes. So I can say that this part of my first chromosome comes from East Africa, and this part of my second chromosome comes from Europe, and this has led to some surprising findings. For instance, in America, there was one study where a man who self-identified as African American was genetically found to be more than 80% Caucasian. But so this is now the world we're in. So that's my introduction. Would you like to add anything to that? Okay, so now I'm going to turn the conversation over to Dr. Jain. And so I think to start with, so I'm going to do this in 2 parts. The first, I'll talk about Dr. Jain's work more specifically. The second, we'll go more broadly to questions of population genetics and history. So the first thing I'd like you to do is tell us a bit about Huntington's disease, not in terms of its genetics, but in terms of how it affects patients.
So Huntington's disease was first defined or described by a person called Huntington, who was a doctor in New England, and who was taking up the practice from his father. And reading his father's notes and seeing his patients, he found a peculiar kind of disorder in which patients, when they became adults or young, mature adults, started having curious dancing-like movements and rapidly progressed to a state of dementia or different kinds of, they lost a lot of their usual cognitive skills, and they had the movement disorders, and they would basically die very soon. The disease would typically begin in the late 30s or 40s, and by a little bit of analysis, he figured out it ran in families, and he kept very detailed family records. This is before the times of Darwin and Mendel. Okay, so we vaguely knew that these things happen in families, and the moment those technologies can be applied, it was clear that it ran in what is known as autosomal dominant manner, which means that 50% of the children of a person like that had a 1 in 2 chance. Each child had a 50% chance of having the disease. If he had the disease, he had it. If he didn't have it, he didn't have it. The person who didn't have it could no longer pass any disease like that to his offspring. So the person who never developed it, his children would be free of the disease forever and forever and forever and forever. The person who had the disease, each child or each offspring would again have a 50% chance of getting this. Now, this is the way it was understood for about 100, 120 years. Till in the 70s, people found a family in Venezuela which had about 100 people affected. They actually lived along the banks of a lake, and about 100 people were affected. Even then, people realized that it had a peculiar thing to do with colonization. So of all the patients, at least the white patients of America who had the disease, seemed to have descended from a person who was part of the Mayflower. And they were somehow related back to that ancestry to the Mayflower. All the patients in Tasmania were related to a single family who had migrated from Wales through India and Australia and ended up in Tasmania. And everybody there was, in a sense, descended from this one person. Now, this was very strange. The disease itself is very interesting because, although it starts at 30, it depends on who is looking at the patient. The movement disorder started 30 or 40, but cognitive symptoms sometimes start a decade earlier. Sometimes people initially develop obsessive compulsive disorder or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, or they become scientists, singers, engineers, and politicians. The most famous person who has contributed the most is Woody Guthrie, one of the founder members of the American Communist Party, folk singer. He had a very tumultuous life. He died in a mental hospital, but he died of Huntington's disease because at that time they were not sure whether Huntington's disease is a psychiatric disease or a neurological disease. And his family, Arlo Guthrie and all the subsequent people, run these concerts every year, and they started the Huntington Disease Society of America to understand why this disease occurs. And that has been one of the most successful family-based efforts to basically contribute to the scientific understanding of the disease. The HDSA, Huntington Disease Society of America, which started initially by the family members of Woody Guthrie, now focuses on research all over the world. And now there are European Huntington Disease Associations, etc., etc. So there's been a lot of movement by people who are affected as to why does this occur. Now, in the 60s and 70s, as the genetic technology became better, you knew that you could possibly identify a gene, and by 1992, that was done. And that's when the problem started happening, because we all live in a post-Nazi era. Under Nazism, the idea that genetically defective people should be eliminated was carried out to its logical, rational extreme. We think about the Holocaust as a political phenomenon, but it was perfected on the mental hospitals. All the mentally ill who were seen to be a burden were eliminated. 200,000 mentally ill people were killed systematically in better and better gas chambers to make them better, who could then be applied to the Jews, etc., etc., etc. But the first experiment was on the mentally ill. So this urge for genetic perfection and the field of eugenics, which was very popular all over the world in the first half of the 20th century, guided this. So you could actually sterilize people by law till about 1980 in Sweden, for example. So there was a move that once you have Huntington disease, should be sterilized and therefore prevent this disease from occurring. So we'll talk about that later. But the disease itself is very interesting because what you see is that the person is completely intact till the disease starts. I've had patients who have really been brilliant scientists, administrators, had budgets running into thousands of crores under their executive authority. But when the disease starts, in about 5 years, they lose everything and have to be fed and cared for. And once they know that, they also know that their children are going to get it, and their grandchildren. Now that creates a particular kind of distress and anxiety, which is truly awesome. And and as a doctor, that's extremely gloomy, that you see a person whom you know how his life will end. Doctors don't like that kind of knowledge. I really don't want to know how my patient will die. I need to know how I can save the life, but if I know that no matter what I do, this person is going to die of this, that is not a happy working environment. And that is the stage that we are at with the Huntington's disease. We've discovered the gene in 1992. That's a long, long time ago. We still haven't found a single way in which you can prevent its occurrence or its progression, leave alone its cure. So this has been, so it's a problem for us, as you can understand.
Thank you. So you've told us about the disease and a little bit about its history, but can you talk to us more about the genetics explicitly and the geographical distribution of mutations and the geographical distribution of the disease?
I'll try to time myself a bit on this. Now, you see, biology and genetics is very interesting because, as you realize, the life form or DNA molecules are shared between everything on Earth, from the bacteria to the virus to the plants. Huntington gene codes for a protein known as Huntington, remnants of which are there in bacteria. So it is a protein which is absolutely essential to all life, although we don't know what it does. If you knock this gene off, obviously the first thing would be, if something is wrong, just take it away and see how the system works. Like for any simple engineering thing. But the problem is that if you take away the Huntington gene, the person dies. The organism dies. So it's critical to life. So it's not, you can't just switch it off. You have to figure out how to regulate it. It turns out that as life forms have evolved, the Huntington gene has become larger and larger and larger and larger and larger. So, and there's a particular component within the Huntington gene, which is a series of repeat of the codon, CAG, CAG. The word repeats itself 10 times in let's say, monkeys. In primates, it's about 10 times. In human beings, it's about 20 times. And if this alphabet repeats itself 40 times, you have a disease. So as this expansion is somehow linked to the capacity of the brain. So this expanded region is preferentially expressed in the brain, and as apparently brain capacities have increased or the complexity of brain processing has increased, the gene has become larger and larger. So that is perhaps at the root of this problem. Why do human beings have such a long repeat, and why do primates have such a small number, and why do bacteria have only 2 or 3 repeats here? Once that has happened, like any over-engineering, once it grows long enough, it is prone for errors. So every time a gene duplicates itself, it has to be precise. Unfortunately, when it becomes 38 or 39 or 40 repeats, it becomes imprecise. So the next cell has 41, the next one has 42, the next one is 43. So every subsequent generation has a more severe form of the disease than the parent had. So assuming, like it was mentioned, we all came from Africa, the repeat size in Africa is only 18 repeats. And to get the disease, you need 40 repeats. So you can imagine you need about 20 or 30 generations away from Africa to have the disease for the first time. And after that, every successive generation will have the disease.
When you say that the repeat size in Africa is just 18, do you mean that everyone in Africa?
Not everyone.
But
That's the largest, on average. Okay. The average for India, for South Asia, is 19 repeats. For Africa, it's 18 repeats. For Japan, it's 17 and a half or 18 repeats still. So there's a little bit of variation.
For Europe?
It's around the same.
Okay.
18.
Okay, so human beings are around the same.
All human beings are around 17 or 18, the normal. But the spread of the abnormal repeats, somehow for some obscure reason, is the highest in Western Europe, Northwest Europe. And now that event, and since this mutation occurred a long time ago in primates, so recent efforts, for example, have looked at the world in a very different way. We all know that the world is circular, but if you can imagine a flat world. So it has 4 large land masses: Africa, Eurasia, and the Americas, and to some extent Australia. In between these, there are mountain ranges. And classical evolution tells you that human beings typically don't breed across these ranges. So east of the Urals and west of the Urals are 2 different groups: the Mongoloid races and the Caucasoid races, or Eurasian races. And it turns out that the Huntington disease in China is a very different beast from the Huntington disease of Europe. The mutation arose before the divergence of human beings. So the gene traveled in both directions, but the way it behaved is very different in Europe and very different from what it did in China. In Northwest Europe, in Germany and Scotland, it became very common. Now before we do that, let me take a step back. It's a very rare disease. It occurs in about 3 people for every 100,000. So it's a very rare disease, compared to diabetes, which is 1 in 100 or something, or 2 in 100. We have in Germany and Scotland, it occurs in 10 people per 100,000, which is 10 times higher. In Africa, it is 0.1 per 100,000, which is several hundred times lesser. In Japan, it is 0.2 per 100,000, which is several hundred thousand times lesser. We have no studies from South Asia, but a study in Leicester and Bradford of people from South Asian origin expected it to be around 3 to 4 per 100,000 in the Indian population derived from Indian origin, mainly Punjabi, Bengali, and Gujarati. They don't have much of South Indians in Leicester and Bradford 20 years ago when they did the study. And so we have this high occurrence of 10 or 15 in Scotland and Germany, 4 or 5 in Asia, in India, and between Germany and India is a steady decline in the rates. So you get 15 in Germany, around 10 or 12 in Switzerland, and about 5, 6 all across the Middle East, and 3 to 4 in India. So that's the general epidemiology. All the cases in North America of European origin have a different rate, those from the Afro-American origin. So disease shows very distinct differences. All the patients in South America showed distinct ancestry back to European heartlands of Spain or Portugal. So that's how the disease has spread itself.
Okay, thank you. So with all that background, I think we can finally come to your findings. So Dr. Jain's work showed a very interesting connection between Huntington's disease patients in India and the history of Tipu Sultan, which I'd like him to elaborate on.
Well, this is I work in a very large psychiatric facility, and we started doing this test for various people. And when you test, it's like, I don't know if it's polite to mention things which are typically so-called crafty, but it's like looking at a piece of string or somebody trying to knit a sweater, a multicolored sweater. You know? So there are fragments of different wool which are there, and if you try to match the green wool, and you have to put a button or whatever, you have to make a design, you know that the green one has to be here, the yellow one has to be here, the red one has to be here. You know exactly how to pattern it. All human genes are the same. So if you look at the same three patterns, you should be able to say, oh, this fragment needs to go here, this fragment needs to go there. So it's relatively easy. It's color-coded in a way. So when you do the color coding around this particular mutation in our patients, we found that the color coding of the patients we got from our local population, which is Bangalore, Mysore, and the 50 kilometers around, was very different when we got patients who were being referred from Bengal or from Delhi. And since the disease is broadly the same, we couldn't figure out why should the background color of this tapestry be different in different people. Then we started wondering what could be the origin, because the disease is pretty damaging and the patients are broadly alike. It's only the background which is different. And then we started looking into the history, and then we realized that the central of Bangalore is technically at the center of southern India. It's 12 hours to either coastline, by road even now. In the olden days, it was approximately a month by bullock cart to reach the coast on either side. And there were huge forests in between, tropical and deciduous forests. It was almost impenetrable till the great Mughal and Ahmadi war and the Ahmadi kingdom wars of the 16th and 17th century. Unlike northern India, which had a continuous land movement between Europe and northern India, there were waves of so-called Aryans, there were waves of invasions from every part of Europe, from the Turks to the Mongols to the Persians. We shouldn't think only of the rulers. The rulers were rich, and the craftsmen that they imported for the Taj Mahal were from Italy and France. The soldiers that they imported were from Ethiopia and Germany. So there was a whole lot of flow of manpower during this period. Not only that, when people from further north would come to loot India, people talk about the loot of Somnathpur and these various temples, but their biggest treasure would be skilled manpower, which they would carry back with them forcefully. The carpenters, the masons, which is why Samarkand and Tashkent look like Indian replicas of Indian art, and Gandhara art went all the way to Tashkent. So there's a huge flow of people back and forth in northern India. So you could track that tapestry being different in northern India. Southern India was isolated from all this. No invader reached through the forests. Nobody traveled all the way south till the British came in. And the British came in with a very particular problem. They had the coastal territories of Madras, Calcutta, Bombay, but the center of India, which was Mysore, which was the richest kingdom, which actually had gold mines, where the Golconda was mined, were impervious to them. They had 4 Mysore wars, and the last one killed off Tipu Sultan. But the first 3 wars, the first with Hyder Ali, the first and second with Hyder Ali, and the last 2 against Tipu, each resulted in a very severe defeat for the soldiers of the East India Company. But Tipu Sultan was not called the tiger for anything, for not adequate reason. He was not a particularly cruel man, although he's portrayed in the local press that time, in the local British press, as being a tyrant. So he was very insistent that Western civilization had much to offer. He was in direct communication with Napoleon. He was a regular writer to the letters that he called them in the Times, the series of letters which he published in the Times. He was quite an intelligent man. So he thought that these British soldiers who were so tenacious and so insistent on fighting are a good thing. And he insisted that when he captured them, that they should marry local women and breed better quality of soldiers. So each soldier was allotted 2 or 3 wives, and So that went on. Of course, there was rape and plunder and all that. That also went on. And when the British left, when these soldiers were forced to go back when they killed Tipu Sultan in 1799, there are touching reports on how sad they felt on leaving their Indian wives. All the soldiers who had been there had to go back. Now, who were these soldiers? These soldiers were from the Perthshire Infantry, Northern Scotland regiments, Devonshire Arms, and the Cornwall Arms. Each of these three areas of England, and Huntington disease has been mapped very extensively in England, have the highest rates of Huntington disease, 14.8 per 100,000 to 16 or 18 per 100,000. So it's quite likely that some of these young men who were soldiers were also carriers of the Huntington disease. They came, and therefore the distinct pattern background of the genes with Huntington disease in Bangalore, in the center of the Deccan, has a direct British influence rather than the trans-Asian, trans-European influence which is there in the patients from Delhi and Calcutta. So that is what got us interested in how we could link up actual historical events, the movements of people, to the occurrence of disease. And this has now become a very valuable way of traveling, of understanding history, because diseases do not respect our linguistic, cultural, linguistic, self-expression, self-identity dynamics at all. A disease is a disease. It won't, once you get cholera, it doesn't matter whether you live in Haiti or in Dhaka or in Calcutta. You'll say the same Vibrio cholerae will kill you no matter where you are. So tracking these disease genes therefore becomes an act of historical detective work. You can see how various diseases, especially these genetic diseases, how they start from one person and how that person's progeny carries it all across the world. So that's the kind of work that helps us understand that when we talk of the British Empire, it's not merely the railways and the English language and the grammar and the rule of law and all that. They also left genetic material behind. And this genetic material is not of a political nature. None of the patients we have seen has ever been an Anglo-Indian. None of the patients we have ever seen, only I think one family is Christian. That's all. So this is not, in their sense, in the patient's sense, any sense of perceived westernization. They are as local as any one of us. But somewhere amongst them is lurking a little fragment which has come from Scotland, which is causing them the disease.
This has actually a lot of interesting parallels with the population genetics of African Americans in many ways, because maybe you can elaborate on that, but I attended a talk once, which was great because it was a population geneticist, but she'd been brought to talk to the African American Studies Department. And it was a really wonderful sort of dialogue between a scientist and people in the humanities. And maybe I don't remember it perfectly, but her basic message was that nearly every African American is going to have very substantial chunks of European genetic material. And this is just, and it really shows you, I think, that there's no way after you see that you can deny that rape and interbreeding between those two communities was actually quite pervasive, right? It wasn't something that happened once, and you see as clear a record of that as anything. So it is very interesting. Do you know of any other traits or diseases like this that you can trace back to this very specific period of European migration that happened recently?
Oh yes. We work on another disease called spinocerebellar ataxias. There are a whole group of diseases, 30 or 40 of them. Each one of them has a number. But the one I'm interested, we looked at first, was something called Machado-Joseph disease. Any of our Goanese friends are here? No. So Machado is obviously a Portuguese name. This has an even more fascinating history. The disease in India clusters around Goa and Calcutta. Mainly because the Portuguese landed in Goa, intermarried, created a group called half-caste. Caste is basically a Portuguese word, so they first defined a group called half-castes. The major dealing was with Calcutta, so the large number of Portuguese seamen or Portuguese Goanese seamen were actually in Calcutta, so that became the second largest center of Portuguese influence, and they collaborated with the Mughal Empire to fight against the British, so that's the second history. Because the Portuguese were technically colorblind, so sailors who converted were then free to travel anywhere in the world. And so the Bishop of Angola in the 19th century ended up being of Goan origin. A nobleman of Indian origin had his daughter married to the King of Portugal. whose offspring ended up getting married to the King of England. And wherever Portuguese sailors went, Indonesia, Japan, South America, the Indian gene flowed with them. And this disease, therefore, is a marker of the Portuguese Empire through India. Because the Indian sailors and the Portuguese interbred produced a particular pattern, which is seen in 2/3 of all cases of this disease anywhere in the world. So you can track that as to how Portuguese colonialism intersected with Indian genetic structure and produced this thing. And of course it happened through addiction. Because the entire island, the Madeira Islands, were deforested and planted with sugarcane to serve the British need for sugar, the European need for sweet tea, which is an addiction, as we all see by the Mishti Doi around. So it has no nutritional value except addictive value. The whole island was deforested, and the only people who could do sugarcane were Indian peasants. So Madeira was populated with Indian peasants, and the churches built at that time have idols of Jesus in the form of Buddha, Mother Mary in feminine South Asian sculptures. So if you go to the Madeira Islands, the churches are filled with Indianized versions of Christianity. And from here, they were then taken to West Indies with slave populations from Africa. And the cannabis plant, which grows wild in Africa, is never smoked. Biharis and Telugu people did. So they introduced the Africans to cannabis. And the results are there in every time you listen to rap music. So there's a whole hidden aspect of the biology of colonialism, which is fascinating.
Thank you so much. So I think that concludes the first half of our talk. If people would like to ask questions about this part, you can do it now, because we're going to move on to a much broader discussion now, so it might get lost. So if anyone has questions specifically about this story.
I've got two questions. First question is a little off topic. What do you have to say about homeopathy? Okay. The second question is color blindness genetic? Is color blindness genetic?
Yes. Some forms of it.
Homeopathy doesn't work.
My question, in Bangladesh, it's a cultural melting pot that we see in their faces. But do you know of any research done on the DNA sequence to find out the origin of this race?
All right. So there are two large studies which have been done by the government of India. One is so-called the Indian Genome Variation Database, which started about 15 years ago, which identified linguistic and religious groups, mainly linguistic and caste groups, with a focus on tribal populations. Now, if you study the genetics of tribal populations in India, it's very fascinating because there are Austroasiatic tribes, which are similar to the Finns and the Lapps in the center of Bihar. Okay, and of course you have the Dravidians, which are similar to the Aborigines, and the main mainland is a mixture between, on the eastern side, between the so-called trans-Himalayan races at the bottom of India, with the Siddhis from Africa, and the rest of India being vaguely Indo-European. So they have mapped all this at least at 4,000 genes to look at the population diversity of various genes in India, and a large part of that is focused on the eastern parts of India, mainly because of the diversity of this part, where the tribal populations have intense linguistic and cultural diversity. So we've been trying to map that in biological terms. A new effort which is underway in Calcutta now is to fully genome sequence 2,000 individuals of South Asian origin of, again, this part of the world, and put their entire diversity data out so that you can map this kinds of studies. So this information is obviously dynamic, but it's available easily. There's a
I couldn't quite follow that why there is so much variation in the probability of getting Huntington diseases between Africa and Europe.
Now that is a very, nobody really has understood that. Because for various issues, the African diversity is very highly selected, because it is the primal so-called primary DNA. And the people have obviously had much more selection pressures in that population. So, in a sense, it is more diverse, but it is also more purified for the so-called, inverted commas, best alleles. Now, one of the assumptions is that as people moved out of that ecozone, different selection pressures occurred, and different genes became altered in a particularly different way. Now, why Huntington gene started expanding, we have no idea. But it really doesn't expand. The expansions are very rare, and they tend to cause disease. The vast majority of us have 17, 18, or 17 to 19 number of repeats. Around 1% of us in this room would have a repeat size which is higher than 30. In Europe, it would be around 3%. And that little difference makes a huge difference in disease. But why that has occurred, I have no idea.
Okay, so what we were talking about here in a minute ago would be genetic mapping, if I could tell that. So my question was that in history, in the regions of India and Bangladesh, we know that people were obsessed with caste and religion and so on and so forth barriers. Now, when we talk about genetics and breeding, would you say that in those eras that the diseases actually started appearing in India and these sites, people were not so obsessed because we have seen much free breeding here among people regardless of their castes or genders? Or would you say that this fact was actually taken into consideration while studying?
I'm not sure I understand the question well, but I put it around the other way. You know, breeding, caste and religious rules, to have population equilibrium, we just need about 2 or 3% of the people deciding to produce children people from the other group for the two groups to become equal. And 2%, love is really not that blind. 2% people will have children from somebody across the railway tracks in any time of known history. So I don't think you can really put too much value on these imaginary distinctions. We just need 2%.
That is exactly what I was thinking. Does this fact have any value in genetic mapping?
It does. It does. Because you see, in many other parts, for example, in southern India, 20% of all families have consanguineous parentage. And that affects disease prevalence in a particular way. In England, people from the Baltistan region of Pakistan, of Kashmir to be precise, who have migrated, they will marry only people within their own village relationship boundaries. So that changes diseases. So you need to understand that. You need to map all their so-called reproductive patterns, but it's part of life.
I was interested in knowing, you're working with genetics as well as history.
Yes.
And in my experience, I'm studying biotechnology and anthropology.
Right.
I find that most people, anthropologists take a very strict, sort of antagonistic view towards the sciences. They believe that sciences try to make everything too, they try to normalize everything, they try to make everything, while anthropologists trying to disrupt notions. And scientists think that anthropologists are way too casual, fuzzy with their beliefs. So how do you marry these two disciplines?
Right.
How do you make them work?
Well, here's where your job as a doctor comes in. You know, in psychiatry is a very different thing from the rest of medicine. In the rest of medicine, people, if you go to a doctor with a cough, he'll ask you, when did this cough start? Do you have a grotty question? Is it green in color? Is it blue in color? Or whatever. So you go to a psychiatrist and he'll ask at the other end, so tell me something about your father and mother. It doesn't matter what your problem is. First I want to understand what your father and mother were like when you were a child. And you're trained into understanding the origins and the familial structure and the social structure under which the psychiatric disease is developed. So when you started seeing patients, you first realized that almost every patient you saw, every person you saw, you had to construct a personal history of that person to really understand what the problem was. And that gives rise to a particular understanding of the historicity of the disease process itself. And if you see enough patients together, then it's not the person, it's the historicity of the disease as a syndrome. And then it becomes the historicity of the syndrome as it appears in the society that you're dealing with. And therefore it just grows from one to the other. I don't see any inherent contradiction between these two terms, between these two fields, because I think both gain from each other remarkably. It just depends on how you approach this. Medicine without, anthropology or sociology is nothing. And I think the other fields would benefit a lot from technology. I mean, it was Rudolf Virchow, the great German doctor, who said politics is nothing but medicine applied on a grand scale. And that's how we should view it.
People don't have any more questions for this first section. I can move on to the second. Okay. All right. Okay, so now we're going to move on to a much broader ranging topic about the applications of population genetics. For Christian, I'm going to ask you with my most broad, vague question. I'm going to start with that. Okay, so all of these advances in population genetics, DNA sequencing technology, it's all very recent. So what is the most sort of revolutionary way it's changed our understanding of the history of human migration? What's the one or two things that's completely upended what we knew from archaeology and other things? Has there been a kind of revolutionary break that's happened to all this?
Not in that drastic a way. What you get is enormous finessing of the details of the tapestry. It's not as if we are inventing a new. We always knew that human beings are different. We always knew that all choleras in the world started from the Ganga. No matter where in the world you get cholera, you're very sure that that bacteria has some time when its ancestry lived in the Ganga. We know that typhoid spread here. We know that sickle cell disease and malaria coexist in a very complex way, so that one disease offsets the disadvantage of the other. We know that typhoid exists here because it protects you against cystic fibrosis. Okay, so the gene which gives you susceptibility to typhoid protects you against cystic fibrosis. The Europeans never had typhoid, but they have the world's highest rate of cystic fibrosis. We get typhoid, but we never get cystic fibrosis. So we must see, again, this is something I just mentioned in the previous talk, we have more bacteria living on us than there are cells which we can call ours. The total number of bacteria living on us is more than the number of cells we have. So when we call ourselves us, whether we are calling ourselves or our bacteria us is a debatable question. And number two, the bacteria don't look at us as anything more than farms. As far as they are concerned, we are providing unique farming areas in our noses, in our guts, and different kinds of bacteria colonize different parts of us. And if all of us died, they would lose one farmhouse. They have so many other mammals to live in. So we are not particularly relevant to the rest of life, and no matter what we think.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start asking you about a few specific papers. So you already mentioned some of the work that's being done on the genetics of the Indian population. I remember in 2009, David Reich, who's a very famous geneticist, authored a paper called Reconstructing Indian Population History. It was a big deal when it came out. It made the cover of Nature. And I'm sure that this work has been elaborated on since then, but could you summarize the most important findings of this paper and how it should affect how we think about the region?
Well, this paper, as was pointed out, was magnificent because it showed how the gene flow from Africa actually diversified into India, into Europe, through the Levant, and how when they hit southern India, because it was a particularly fertile region, there was a population explosion, and this population explosion that led into further migrations, and it, in a sense, overturns a lot of our basic popular myths. The Aryans now seem as an offshoot of Dravidians, who then rolled back after some years, but they are an offshoot, which accounts for the blonde hair and blue eyes, which are recessive traits. Again, one of the easy ways to explain genetics is you draw a latitude or an iso, these iso lines of altitude and all. You can draw a so-called blonde line across the world, where blonde people are more common than others. And that line has been shifting towards the North Pole gradually over the last 200 years. As more and more people from the equator intermarry with Europeans, the recessive traits are disappearing. So blonde hair will become extinct in a few years, because obviously there are more people who are non-blonde than who are blonde. So it's a natural, not selection, it's a gradual drift. It's not a selection, it's a drift. But the natural state is a non-blonde state, and that will overcome the transient.
Some people call that white genocide.
But these kinds of things, in a way, affect the way we look at ourselves. So these population flows, so to come back to David Wright, now this kind of thing gave rise to a whole series of micro studies of India. People have studied the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial chromosome. The mitochondrial chromosome in all of us comes from our mothers. The Y chromosome in men obviously comes from the father. So you can map the difference between the two and say how many mothers were of a particular group and how many fathers were of a particular group. And then it turns out, depending on which center in India did the study, people who are very concerned about casteism always find that upper caste men impregnated lower caste women, because that's the way the power dynamics works. But then you look at the western coast and they find the difference between the highest caste and the lowest caste was actually inconsequential. People who did this genome mapping found that the two most closest in terms of genetic ancestry were UP Brahmins and UP Muslims. They were the closest genetically linked people. So everything that we imagine as being farthest apart socially is actually very close biologically. So we really have to keep this in mind when we talk of our current politics.
Okay, so I don't have too many more questions, but I have a few kind of controversial results that I thought might be fun to talk about. So some scientists, this isn't a very credible theory, but it's something that does have some credence. I'm still going to talk about it. So some people have actually proposed that Ashkenazi Jews as a group are genetically more intelligent than other groups as a product of their specific history. So what are your views, not just on this hypothesis, but these kinds of hypotheses?
They're also more prone to breast cancer.
I'm sure that's just
and to put one more valuable than the other is a mistake. Now, you see, medicine has this wonderful way of coming up with simple solutions to very complex problems. Now, it is really a very simple way of looking at it. If we really think of human beings, what came first, our brain or our thumb? Most of our brain is designed to just rotate this thumb and use opposable thumb, which gave rise to tools. But which came first? The brain made the hand move in this way, or did the hand change first and force the brain to follow? We have no way of understanding that. So whether intelligence as a trait has any inherent value, we have no idea. We have no idea. But ants make wonderfully complex, any weaver bird will make a more complex design than any architecture PhD can do, without ever going to college, I presume.
But what about,
so this whole issue of intelligence or social cognitive psychology, evolutionary psychology is a very intense field, because you really have to understand why does the human brain evolve these skills and what is the background of this. So it turns out that if you look at, for example, histories of schizophrenia, people in the family have a higher rate of schizophrenia, they have a higher rate of intellectual handicap, but they also, as far as the Scandinavian studies are concerned, also have high rates of geniuses. So the capacity to have weird thoughts or new thoughts is more valuable than the occasional mistake. So if 99% of us can think logically most times and 5% can have really good ideas, the 1% who really cannot do that is an acceptable level. Now, intelligence is therefore along that continuum, just like craziness. Nobody can define what intelligence is, nobody can define what craziness actually is. So it's inherited in a broad way, but to say that one particular genetic group of people has more craziness or more intelligence than others would be putting the cart before the horse.
So you reject the idea that something like an IQ test or anything can ever objectively measure anything?
No, because they are irrelevant. They are irrelevant to our existence.
Absolutely. Okay. So, yeah, let me hurry up a bit. Okay, I just want to talk about one finding because it's fun. So a recent study looked at the genetics of violent criminality among Finnish prisoners, and it claimed to find alleles or mutations that predict violent criminality. So if you're born with these alleles, you're more likely to be a kind of violent psychopath. Do you find these specific findings believable? And do you think that these results could change the ethics and practice of criminal justice, or these kinds of results?
Well, that's going to delay everyone, I guess. No, but that's really see, when you apply the genetic microscope to these kinds of big problems, it's really a trouble. So when you start looking at jail populations, Even if you do a CT scan or MRI scan, you'll find 20% of people in prisons actually show signs of brain damage. Okay, because that's why they are behaving like that, I presume. If you start looking at genetic tests, now this was something that came up in England many years ago, I think 1950s or 60s, that people who had two XYY chromosomes or had three male sex chromosomes, they were much more violent than others. As is understandable, with just a single Y chromosome, imagine three of them. So there was a kind of proportionality there. And then they realized that these are actually people with very severe intellectual deficits. And now the whole field has shifted into what we call attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So a certain amount of children with attentional problems in childhood go up into troubled teenagers. They behave in a certain way, their brains change in a certain way, then they're more likely to become criminals. Now, using methods in genetics, you can probably track the genes that are responsible for this so-called abnormal behavioral or abnormal growth pattern. But then one must realize on the other side that when people apply the same scale, so let's say New York stockbrokers, you come to exactly the same findings. Okay, so between criminality, sociopathy, stockbroking, finance trading, there's a kind of continuum, half of which we call criminal and half of which we laud. Now the problem is that risk-taking behavior or aggressive behavior or fighting are things which are actually encouraged by a political system. We maintain armies and police, don't we? So the fact that these traits could be reduced to genetics should always be viewed with caution, because along with it, we have to look at the wider question that how is aggressiveness as a trait embedded in our cognition, in our genetics, in our biology. After all, we are not all made to be Gautam Buddhas. We have to work to become Gautam Buddhas. So there is a trait of aggression which perhaps has the evolutionary significance of competition and survival of the fittest, blah, blah, blah. So to delete all of it may be a problem. So it's a complex one. But you can probably, with accurate genetics, predict a large part of the risk in the near future. Whether it changes the legal system, whether you can use that as a mea culpa, as excuse that, you know, oh, I am only violent because I had this genetic change, please don't punish me, I don't think that would work.
You might preemptively jail people.
Ah, that would be, but you're more dangerous than I thought.
I'm going to ask one very big question right at the end and then turn it over to the audience. And I think it's sort of always the question that's looming in these discussions. So do these recent findings of population genetics support or challenge biological racism?
There is no such thing as biological racism. Racism, as we know, got invented soon after Darwin published his work as some kind of quasi or non-scientific jargonish way to substantiate the organization of races as was seen in the late 19th century. Even if you look at, for example, the first book of Insanity was written in Dhaka, in the Dhaka Asylum in 1854, Treatise of Indian and of Insane in India. And at that point of time, the writer sees no essential difference between Indians and Europeans. There is nothing like that. You see any textbook written in the early 20th century, Indians are like this as a race. So this idea of a race affecting the behavior or predictability of a person of that race is a very recent concept. It's a late 19th century, early 20th century concept. The moment we understood more about genetics using DNA technology, that went out. It was only 1920 and 30 that you could actually have studies on IQs in the Hottentots, IQs in African Americans, IQs in Indians, IQs in this. All that went out in 1950. And now, it's like the phrenology of the 19th century. So there is no such thing as biological racism. There is one species, the PubMed stops at Homo sapiens. After that, every organism has a name, has a 12-letter name. Genus, group, phylum, group, blah, blah, blah. And Homo sapiens stops at Homo sapiens. There's no further classification. So that's all it is.
I'd like to now turn it over to the audience for any questions they might have.
Very quick question. I'm not sure I'll be able to articulate it to make some effort to understand my question, which is, you know, I mentioned it in the other talk. I was I was reading Yuval Harari's book, Homo Deus and Homo Sapiens, and he was saying that at the end of the day, the current understanding is that we humans are nothing special. Okay. our love now can be scanned with MRI or whatever, and what does it mean? These are all algorithms, that's what to say. You know, anger, love, whatever, sacrifice, everything. Everything can be manipulated at the same time. Where does all these findings, lead us to? I mean, are we going to get rid of human identity, consciousness, or whatever? Are we becoming another computer?
What if we already are and we don't know?
Yeah.
Do we have free will?
No, that's what the same issue. So that's an offline case.
No, we don't.
Yes.
Can I ask a question now or later?
There's a question there. Two questions there.
Yeah. What is the future of like gene therapy and movies like Gattaca? Is that gonna? Are we gonna see something like that? Or we're already seeing it to some level? What is the future?
We are already seeing it to some level. After all, pre-implantation genetic testing is now widely available, so you can modify the next generation to be free of Huntington's disease. We can modify the genetic material. The Chinese have already asked for a patent to be allowed to do gene editing in human embryos. So it's not a question of whether, it's a question of when and how. So, see, ultimately, our society will be what we make of it. So it's impossible to predict, but these technologies will be there. And if you have a hammer, you will discover a nail. So the question is, would you rather not have the hammer? So I can't really answer that question, but I really don't, whether you go to the Gattaca kind of scientific horror or you look at a world free of cancer, equal possibilities. The gentleman behind you had a question. No, the same one, like you said. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we really can't answer that because what is humanness? How is humanness different from a Drosophila-ness of a Drosophila? When a mosquito lives for 24 hours, does it have a youth? Does it have adolescence? Does it have a middle age? Does it have death? We don't really know.
My question is, recently what happened in Bangladesh, holy cat, has shocked Bangladesh. It seemed what's happening in the world has come home. My question is, and the people who did it, they are from middle class, upper middle class backgrounds and educated kids. Now, I would have thought it's simply religious brainwashing or socioeconomic scenarios or whatever. Does DNA or does genetics have any, would they be more vulnerable for any particular reason, or would it just be?
I don't think so. One would have to stretch the knowledge of genetics to epigenetics and all kinds of fanciful methods to explain this. But I think this is part of a general, as has been discussed repeatedly at many symposia already, is a kind of failure of the age of reason, that we don't seem to be discovering the answer to our humanness through reason and rationality, and we quickly, like a pendulum, swing to the other extreme because we think this one is useless, now let's go the other way. There has to be moderation, it's a very gradual process to actually be part of this perspective of science and actually being a very, very slow incremental process. There are no miraculous answers to the big questions of life in a scientific lab. You basically need to know, is the water clean enough? Can I get my next funding grant? Can I write this paper? So it's not glamorous, it's not ideologically driven, but it adds, I think, much more depth to our day-to-day life. And I think people have to realize that this little detail is actually the meaning of life. We don't need to look for bigger meanings. If I can help one patient's life, that is that. I don't need to answer the nature of man in the universe. I need to do just this.
I think I have one observation and one question. The observation is, I really enjoyed your presentation, especially the first half when you kind of presented a social history of disease, I would say. And as you know that in academia, we normally like to divide science from social science, or there are actually a lot of pigeonholing. And your presentation once more proves that we do not need this pigeonholing. Rather, we need, I would say, more and more merger between science and social science. How can we do that? That is one question. And let me move to another larger question, possibly, that I attended your and Professor Abid Chaudhry's earlier presentation, and both these presentations make the point that this whole notion of race, on which the world is, I would say, fighting each other for a long, long time, are possibly silly and meaningless. I mean, if you look at from this population genetics point of view, how can we really, because, as you know, there is a lot of race studies going on, again in academia, but I'm not talking about academia now, I'm talking about whole world, let's say. How can we really feel people that, this idea of ethnicity is not a given one, and we should not fight each other on this perceived notion of ethnicity?
Yeah. But see, we all know that the sciences or C.P. Snow's thing of the worlds has to come together. And I think we must, especially those of us, like, I guess the responsibility is people like us who are teachers, that we have to really inculcate this grassroots merger between the two. You do not see a patient of any disease without understanding his social background. And no social scientist should actually talk of ideology without actually seeing what happens to people when you put that ideology into place. So I think there has to be a closer working together at the grassroots of all these things. But to come to your issue about race, I really have no answers to this, except that these kinds of isms are invented. After all, everybody knows that we are one. But obviously, if you are inventing partitions, then there is an equal urge to do this.
We're out of time.
Okay.
Okay.
So we are out of time.
Thank you, everyone.